Why did the poor freeze in the Victorian era while the rich slept in warmth? The reasons will surprise you. Behind the glittering facade of the Victorian era, with its balls and technological progress, lay a chasm separating two worlds. In one world, ladies in silk dresses read novels by the fireplace, while in the other, women in rags tried to warm themselves with the breath of their loved ones. This story is not about palaces and factories, but about the most intimate space, the bedroom, which was a fortress of comfort for some and an icy trap for others. We will look behind velvet curtains and into the frost-covered corners of shacks to understand how social inequality manifested itself in the most basic human right, the right to warmth and rest. We will see how differently the night passed for a noblewoman and a worker separated by just a few streets, but a whole universe. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how a simple bed warmer reflected a woman's social status and why sleeping in clothes was not a whim, but the only chance to live to see the morning. What if I told you that everything you believed about the comforts of the past is not true? We often imagine the past based on books, but we rarely think about the most important things, the air and smells that filled the rooms. The air in an aristocrat's bedroom was completely different from that in the homes of the poor. The noblewoman's room was regularly aired, but this was done wisely so as not to let the precious heat escape. The air was filled with the scents of lavender sachets, expensive perfumes, and polished wood. It was the air of tranquility and idleness. In the working-class shack, the air was heavy and stale. It smelled of dampness, coal smoke, unwashed clothes, and food cooked in the same room where they slept. This air was saturated with fatigue and hopelessness. For a wealthy woman, the bedroom was a private space, a refuge from the outside world. She could retreat there to rest or engage in her thoughts. It was her territory, albeit within strict social norms. For a poor woman, her whole life took place in one room. There was no place for privacy, no personal space. The air was shared by the whole family with all its troubles and worries. In winter, the contrast became even more striking. In the noble bedroom, a fire crackled in the fireplace, filling the air with dry warmth and a light smell of smoke. It was the smell of comfort and security. In the poor's dwelling, the only source of heat, if there was any at all, was a small stove. It smoked, filling the already cramped room with acrid smoke. Breathing such air was not only unpleasant, but also dangerous. The rich woman breathed the air of privilege, which protected her health and peace of mind. She was protected from the cold and damp by thick walls and good heating. Her world was designed for comfort. The poor woman breathed the air of need. Constant dampness caused illness, and the cold penetrated to the bone. Her dwelling was built not for living, but for survival. Thus, even an invisible substance, air, served as a vivid marker of social stratification. It was either a luxury or another trial. I am very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think was the hardest part of the poor woman's life in that era? The cold or the lack of personal space? Write about it in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about the heart of an aristocratic bedroom? The bed, which was not just a piece of furniture, but an entire universe? For a Victorian aristocrat, the bed was the center of her personal world. It was a monumental structure made of carved mahogany or oak, often decorated with a canopy. The main function of the bed was to protect against the cold. Heavy velvet or tapestry curtains surrounded it on all sides, creating a kind of room within a room. They retained heat and protected the sleeper from the drafts that swept through the huge, poorly heated halls of the castles. The mattress was a multi-layered construction. At the bottom, there could be a hard straw mattress, and on top, several soft feather beds stuffed with goose down. This created incredible softness and additional insulation from the cold. The bedding was made of the finest linen or cotton, often decorated with embroidery and lace. There were many sheets and blankets, woolen blankets, quilted bedspreads, down feather beds. All this created a warm and cozy cocoon. Before bedtime, the maid prepared her mistress's bed. One of her main duties was to warm the bed. For this, they used a special metal hot water bottle with a long handle, which was filled with hot coals from the fireplace. This hot water bottle was used to carefully iron the sheets to remove the cold and dampness. Lying down in a pre-warmed bed in a cold room was a real bliss. It was a luxury that was inaccessible to the vast majority. The bed was also a status symbol. Its size, materials, and decoration spoke of the family's wealth and position. It was a place not only for sleeping, but also for morning rest, reading, and sometimes even for receiving close friends. For women, it was the only place where they could truly relax and take off their tight corsets. Here, they were the mistresses of their own little world. However, this luxury had a downside. The bed also symbolized the closed world of women, limited to home and family. It was the center of her existence, but also the boundary of her freedom. But was this luxurious bed a symbol of comfort or, rather, a gilded cage? But if the rich protected themselves so carefully from the cold, what was hidden behind the thin walls of the workers' shacks? The answer to this question may shock you. What I am about to show you was hidden behind the beautiful picture of a prosperous empire. While the aristocrat basked in down-filled feather beds, the worker's family often had no bed at all. The word bedroom was meaningless to them because their whole life took place in a single room. The floor served as a place to sleep. At best, a straw mattress, a bag filled with ordinary straw, was thrown on it. Over time, the straw became matted, turning into a hard and uncomfortable bedding. Often, there was not even that. People slept directly on bare boards, with a bundle of their meager clothing under their heads. The poorest families slept on a pile of rags or wood shavings in the corner of the room. There was no question of bedding. They covered themselves with whatever they had, their own coats, old sacks, or a single thin, worn blanket for the whole family. It was not a shelter, but only an illusion of protection from the cold. The main way to keep warm was human warmth. The whole family, parents and several relatives, slept huddled together, pressed tightly against each other. It was the only source of heat available to them. Such sleep did not provide real rest. The lack of personal space, constant cold and hard surface meant that people woke up as tired as when they went to bed. The floor in such dwellings was cold and damp. Wooden boards often had cracks through which an icy wind blew. Dampness from the ground penetrated the room, making sleep not only uncomfortable, but also hazardous to health. This situation was especially difficult for women. They did not have a single minute or centimeter of space that belonged only to them. Their bodies knew no rest, day or night. Sleeping on the floor was a daily reminder of her place in this world. It was not just a domestic inconvenience, but the physical embodiment of poverty and social humiliation. There was no room here for dreams or peace. The contrast with the aristocrat's bed was stark. If there was a whole universe of comfort created for one person, here there was only a cold corner where several people fought for survival. This is what happened behind the closed doors of the richest houses. The central element of the noble bedroom, apart from the bed, was the fireplace. It was not just a source of heat, but a true work of art and a symbol of wealth. Fireplaces were made from expensive materials: marble, granite, onyx. All of these were used. The mantelpieces were decorated with intricate carvings, family crests, and sculptural elements. The size of the fireplace was important. The larger and more richly decorated the fireplace, the higher the status of its owner. It was the heart of the room, around which the entire interior was built. However, despite all their beauty, large fireplaces were not very efficient. Most of the heat escaped up the chimney. Therefore, even in rooms with a huge blazing fireplace, it could be quite cool, especially away from the fire. Maintaining a fire in the fireplace was a science in itself and required constant work. This work fell on the shoulders of the servants. From early morning until late at night, servants carried heavy baskets of coal or firewood. They had to constantly monitor the fire, add fuel, clean the chimney, and remove ashes. The masters simply enjoyed the warmth and the sight of the living flames. This was yet another marker of their privileged position. Special accessories stood by the fireplace: wrought iron grates, tongs, pokers, and shovels. All of them were not only functional, but also decorative, often made of bronze or brass. In the evening, the family could gather around the fireplace, but in the bedroom it served primarily for the comfort of the hostess. A cozy armchair by the fire was the perfect place to read or do needlework before bed. The fireplace created an atmosphere of peace. Having your own fireplace in the bedroom was a sign of the highest aristocracy. In simpler homes, fireplaces were only found in shared living rooms. It was a luxury that few could afford. How much coal do you think it took to heat one such house? But if the rich had coal and fireplaces, how did the poor escape the bitter cold in their slums? In the next chapter, you will learn about their desperate methods. If there was a source of heat in the homes of the poor, it was the complete opposite of an aristocratic fireplace. Most often, it was a small cast iron stove, or simply an open hearth in the corner of the room. These devices were primitive and unsafe. The main problem was fuel. Coal and firewood were expensive, and poor families could not afford to buy enough of them. Fuel was conserved by heating the stove only for a short time to cook food. Therefore, people burned anything that could burn. Wood scraps, garbage, old rags, and even dried waste were used. All of this emitted acrid and harmful smoke when burned. The chimneys in such houses were poor or non-existent. The room quickly filled with carbon monoxide. Headaches and malaise were constant companions of the slum dwellers, but they did not associate this with air quality. Such a stove provided little heat. It could warm up the immediate vicinity a little, but the corners of the room still remained icy. The walls were covered with frost and the water in the bucket froze. To save fuel, the room cooled down completely overnight. The morning began in an icy room. The woman's first task was to light a fire, to warm up the dwelling a little, and prepare a meager breakfast. An open fire or a hot stove in a cramped, cluttered room posed a constant fire hazard. A single spark falling on a straw mattress or old clothes could lead to tragedy. Fires in the slums were a frequent occurrence. For women, the stove was the center of their difficult daily life. They used it to cook, heat water for washing, and dry clothes. It was not a symbol of comfort, but a working tool that required constant attention. The lack of proper heating affected all aspects of life. People were constantly cold, which undermined their health. Warmth was not a basic comfort, but a luxury that had to be fought for every day. This daily struggle for a few degrees of warmth took a lot of energy and time. While an aristocrat read a book by the fireplace, a worker searched the streets for wood chips to heat her smoky stove. Want to know the secret hidden behind the massive doors of Victorian ladies' dressing rooms? Clothes and textiles in an aristocrat's bedroom played just as important a role in protecting against the cold as the fireplace. It was a whole system thought out down to the smallest detail. A wealthy woman's nightwear consisted of several layers. First came a long shirt made of thin cotton or linen. Over it was worn a warm peignoir or quilted robe made of wool or silk. Warm stockings were worn on the feet and a nightcap on the head. The cap was an essential item, as a lot of heat is lost through the head. It protected against the cold and helped to keep the hairstyle in place. In addition to clothing, numerous blankets and bedspreads played an important role. The bottom sheets were linen and the top layers were warm. Heavy wool blankets were used, which retained heat very well. The height of luxury was a down quilt or feather bed. Lightweight and incredibly warm, they were only available to the wealthiest families. It was a real cocoon that protected against any frost. In the morning when getting out of bed, ladies did not step on the cold floor. There was always a thick rug made of natural wool or even animal skin next to the bed. Their feet immediately slipped into warm, fur-lined slippers. This whole multi-layered system required care, which was provided by a maid. She washed and ironed fine linen, cleaned woolen robes, and looked after the condition of the bedding. It was invisible but enormous work. The fabrics were not only functional, but also decorative. Silk, velvet, lace, all of these adorned the bedroom, emphasizing the status of its owner. The color and pattern of the textiles were chosen to match the overall interior of the room. For a woman, choosing nightwear and robes was part of her beauty and self-care ritual. Even in the privacy of her bedroom, she had to look elegant. It was part of her upbringing and social code. How many layers of clothing do you think one had to wear to stay warm in a huge castle? But what did those who had neither silk nor maids wear? In the next chapter, we will look at the wardrobe of the poor, if you can call it that. In the world of the poor, clothing had one sole function: to protect against the cold. Beauty or elegance were out of the question. The wardrobe of a worker and his family was extremely meager and consisted of the most necessary worn-out clothes. People often slept in the same clothes they wore during the day. This was not due to uncleanliness, but rather a harsh necessity. The extra layers of fabric helped to retain body heat at night. There was no question of special nightgowns or pajamas. Women could only take off their outer dresses, remaining in their underskirts and shirts. Men slept in their work pants and shirts. If the family had a blanket, it was shared by everyone. Usually it was a worn, patched cover made of coarse wool or simply pieces of old fabric sewn together. It barely covered the sleepers. Outer clothing was often used as additional cover. An old coat or shawl was a real treasure. They were spread over the blanket to create another layer of protection from the cold. Textiles in the home were worth their weight in gold. Any rag was put to good use. Old clothes were cut into patches, sewn into blankets, and made into bedding. Nothing was thrown away. Women bore the entire burden of caring for clothing. They endlessly washed in icy water, dried clothes by the smoky stove, and repaired worn items. Keeping clothes in good condition was one of their main tasks. Shoes were always taken off at night and kept safe. Boots were extremely valuable. Often a family had only one pair of more or less decent shoes for everyone, which they wore in turn. Unlike an aristocrat, for whom clothing was a means of self-expression, for a working woman it was merely a tool for survival. Every item in her wardrobe was the result of thrift and hard work. The contrast was striking. While a rich lady had separate outfits for morning, afternoon, and evening, a poor woman had one shirt that she wore day and night until it fell apart. The bedroom of a Victorian aristocrat was her kingdom, but it was a kingdom with very strict boundaries. It was a space intended for rest, beauty, and procreation. Any other activity was considered inappropriate. The day of a woman of high society was strictly regulated. The morning began with the maid bringing her breakfast in bed. This was followed by a long dressing ritual that could take several hours. In her bedroom or adjoining boudoir, a lady could read, embroider, or write letters. These were the only activities considered appropriate for a woman of her circle. Work or education were out of the question. The bedroom was a place where a woman asserted her status through expensive things. Perfume bottles, silver hairbrushes, jewelry boxes, all of this was part of her world. Her main task was to be a beautiful decoration in her husband's home. At the same time, she was not completely in charge even here. Her life depended entirely on her husband. He provided her with a luxurious existence, but in return demanded complete obedience and propriety. The bedroom thus became a gilded cage for her. She was protected from cold and need, but deprived of freedom of choice and the opportunity for self-realization. Her world was comfortable, but very small. Even her health and body did not belong to her. Medical examinations, pregnancy, childbirth, all this took place within the walls of the bedroom, under the control of male doctors and her husband. Her opinion was rarely taken into account. She was isolated from the real world with its problems and difficulties. Life outside the walls of her luxurious home was an abstraction to her. She did not know the price of the coal for her fireplace or the linen for her sheets. A woman's role was reduced to that of a homemaker, but for her, this home was more like a prison. Her bedroom was the most comfortable room in this prison. Thus, the warmth and comfort of her bedroom were not only a privilege, but also a symbol of her dependence. She slept in warmth, but her life was cold and empty of the meaning she could have given it. For a working-class woman, the room in which she slept was not a place of rest, but a daily battlefield. There was no division into areas for sleeping, working, and eating. Everything took place within a few square meters. Her day began long before dawn, in the cold and darkness. She had to light the fire, prepare food for the whole family, and get her husband ready for work. There was no time to rest. During the day, this same room became her workplace. She washed, mended, cooked, and cleaned. If the family took work home, such as sewing or gluing boxes, the room became a mini factory. For women, this space was filled with endless labor. She had no maids or cooks. She did all the heavy physical work herself, often while pregnant or weakened. This room was also an infirmary. When a family member fell ill, she cared for them right there among the others. The lack of hygiene and overcrowding contributed to the rapid spread of illness. In the evening, after her husband and children returned, the room was filled with noise and commotion. The woman had no moment of silence or privacy. She was constantly surrounded by people and their needs. Her role was not limited to housekeeping. She was responsible for the family budget. With the meager pittance her husband brought home, she had to manage to buy food, fuel, and pay for housing. Her life was full of stress and hard physical labor. Unlike an aristocrat, she had no time for reading or needlework for her soul. Her hands were constantly at work so that her family could survive. The room where she slept witnessed her entire life, her fatigue, her rare joys, her despair. It was a space where she fought for the survival of her loved ones. She was deprived not only of comfort, but also of basic human dignity. But it was on her shoulders that the fragile world of a working-class family rested. The last but not least important aspect that divided the worlds of the rich and the poor was access to water and hygiene. In the bedroom of an aristocrat or in the adjoining bathroom, there was a wash basin set. It consisted of a large jug and a basin made of earthenware. Every morning, the maid brought her mistress hot water for washing. She also had clean soap, towels, various lotions, and creams. Personal hygiene was part of her daily routine. By the end of the era, the first bathrooms with running water began to appear in some of the wealthiest homes. The opportunity to take a hot bath was an unthinkable luxury. It was available only to a select few. In the homes of the poor, the situation was catastrophic. There was no running water. Water had to be carried in buckets from the only tap on the entire street, often after standing in long queues. Water was conserved because it took a lot of effort to get it. The whole family would take turns using the same basin of cold water. There was no question of hot water for washing. Soap was expensive, so it was used rarely. Personal towels were also out of the question. Hygiene was at a very primitive level, which posed a constant threat to health. All amenities were often located in the courtyard and were shared by several dozen families. Unsanitary conditions were the norm. It was humiliating and dangerous. Women were responsible for cleaning the house and doing the laundry. They had to wash in ice-cold water using lye instead of soap. This work took a lot of strength and damaged the skin on their hands. Thus, even in such intimate matters as hygiene, the gap between the two women was enormous. One had access to cleanliness and comfort, which was an integral part of her status. The other lived in conditions that we would today call a humanitarian disaster. This division clearly shows that social inequality permeated absolutely all spheres of life, from air quality to the ability to simply wash with warm water. We have lifted the veil on two completely different worlds that existed side by side in the Victorian era. The bedroom, which should be a symbol of rest and safety, was a fortress of luxury for some and an icy battlefield for survival for others. The story of these two bedrooms is not about furniture and fabrics, but about human dignity. It shows how deeply social inequality penetrates the very foundations of existence, determining not only the quality of life, but also its very possibility. Behind the warmth and comfort of the rich lay the invisible labor and deprivation of the poor. And it was women at opposite ends of this system who felt its injustice most acutely, whether in a gilded cage or an icy shack. What other hidden aspects of history would you like to explore? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.